David Hampton smiled at his wife Melissa every morning. But behind that smile was a secret plan to make her disappear, simply because she no longer looked the way he wanted. David and Melissa Hampton were the kind of couple people in their neighborhood talked about with admiration. They had a neat, beige two-story home with white shutters, a green lawn always trimmed to perfection, and matching outdoor chairs on the porch. David drove a polished black SUV, always clean. Melissa often wore sundresses and had a gentle smile when walking her dog or watering her roses. At a glance, they seemed like a couple who had everything under control: love, comfort, and routine. But those closest to them began to notice something else, something harder to define. The light in Melissa's eyes had started to dim. David had always been a man who cared about appearances. He prided himself on being organized, successful, and respected in their suburban Ohio community. As a real estate broker, he relied on charm and looks to win clients. His social media was filled with smiling selfies at open houses, gym workouts, and motivational quotes. He was known for hosting barbecues in the summer, bringing expensive wine, and keeping his lawn in competition with the neighbors. But behind the smiles, David's standards were rigid, especially for Melissa. In the early years, Melissa was praised for her beauty. She had been thinner then, active and full of energy. But after a painful miscarriage and ongoing thyroid issues, she began to gain weight. Her once thin frame softened, and her clothes stopped fitting the same way. She tried to hide her discomfort with sweaters and loose cardigans, but David noticed. And David didn't like it. The change in his behavior started subtly. He stopped complimenting her. He began sitting farther away from her on the couch. He criticized her eating habits under the guise of being helpful. When friends came over, Melissa became quieter, afraid to say the wrong thing. David, on the other hand, laughed louder, made passive-aggressive jokes at her expense, and spoke as though she weren't even in the room. Melissa tried to keep their marriage intact. She started walking in the mornings, cutting carbs, drinking smoothies. She downloaded fitness apps and followed online workouts. But her body didn't respond the way she wanted. The doctor said her metabolism was slow due to her medical condition. She grew frustrated, tired, and embarrassed. And David only grew more distant. What Melissa didn't know was that David had already emotionally checked out. He had started spending more time at the gym, where he began seeing a younger woman, Caitlin, a personal trainer who laughed at his jokes and admired his dedication. To her, David was charming and self-made. He didn't mention Melissa at first, and when he did, he described her as someone struggling and not the woman she used to be. As months passed, David's resentment turned into bitterness. He believed Melissa had given up. In his mind, he deserved more. Someone who matched his looks, someone who didn't drag him down. The man who once promised to love and cherish his wife now viewed her as a burden, a source of shame. Then came the life insurance policy. David convinced Melissa to sign paperwork for financial protection, claiming it was normal for married couples. The policy was large, $750,000, and heavily favored David as the sole beneficiary. Melissa didn't think much of it. She trusted him. They had been married for 9 years. But the timing was deliberate. David was preparing. Friends noticed a shift in Melissa's behavior around this time. She stopped baking for neighbors like she used to. Her once vibrant garden began to wither. She missed volunteer shifts at the animal shelter. Some suspected she was dealing with depression. Others thought maybe the marriage was failing. But no one guessed the truth. Beneath the surface of their tidy suburban home, something was quietly unraveling. David had made up his mind. He didn't want to divorce Melissa. He didn't want the public mess, the sympathy she might get, the questions about why he left a woman after her health struggles. He wanted her gone, completely, quietly, without scandal. And in his mind, he had already started writing the ending. Melissa, unaware of how deep his resentment ran, still tried to fix things. She signed up for therapy. She started planning a new hobby. She wanted to launch a baking blog, something creative to lift her spirit. She ordered a secondhand camera online. It arrived in a box that sat unopened on the kitchen counter. She believed things could still get better. But David had already decided they wouldn't. The morning Melissa Hampton vanished began like any other. The sun was just beginning to rise over the rooftops of the neighborhood, casting golden light across the neatly aligned driveways. A neighbor walking his dog remembered seeing her out front, watering her flower beds in a long pink robe. She waved at him with a tired smile. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. David told police that when he woke up around 8 a.m., Melissa was gone. He said she must have gone for a walk like she sometimes did. But her slippers were still by the back door. Her phone was plugged in beside the bed, untouched. Her keys were in the drawer. Her purse hadn't moved from the hallway table. It didn't make sense to be why afternoon Melissa hadn't returned. David began texting her friends, asking if they had seen or heard from her. He called her mother in tears, saying Melissa had left without a word. He even posted a vague message on Facebook, urging anyone with information to reach out. By evening, the police were involved. Flyers were printed and shared. A missing persons report was filed. Volunteers searched nearby parks, roadsides, and wooded trails. Police combed through hours of surveillance footage from nearby traffic cameras, local stores, and intersections. Melissa's face appeared on the evening news. Her smile was warm, her eyes kind, the kind of photo that made people stop and stare. But there were no clues. No one had seen her leave. No one had heard a struggle. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. David appeared devastated. He gave tearful interviews to local media, pleading for help. He stood outside their home with red eyes and trembling hands, hugging Melissa's friends and family. Reporters praised his composure. People commented online, calling him a devoted husband. But behind the scenes, things began to shift. Within 3 weeks of her disappearance, David sold Melissa's car. He told the DMV she wouldn't be needing it anymore. He removed photos of her from the walls and boxed up her clothes. Her favorite books vanished from the shelves. Her baking supplies were donated. Her camera, still unopened in its box, was tossed in the garage under a tarp. It was as though he was erasing her, one object at a time. That Melissa's family grew suspicious. Her mother said Melissa had never gone anywhere without her phone. Her best friend insisted she had plans to meet up the following week. She had been excited about starting her blog. She had even written down names for it in a notebook. Nothing about this was voluntary. Detectives assigned to the case kept watching David. His behavior didn't align with someone in mourning. He wasn't asking for updates. He wasn't calling the police for progress. Instead, he was back at the gym, posting photos of his workouts, and spending long hours away from home. It was during a routine canvass of the neighborhood that a detective knocked on the door of a couple who lived across the street. They had a doorbell camera that captured the Hampton driveway. The footage showed nothing unusual during the day of Melissa's disappearance. But at 2:46 a.m., something disturbing appeared. A shadowy figure, tall, likely male, was seen dragging a large plastic container toward an SUV. The footage was grainy, the lighting poor, but it was enough to raise alarms. Detectives returned to the Hampton home with a warrant. They searched the garage, backyard, closets, and the attic. One thing stood out. Melissa's large outdoor garden bin was missing, the kind used to hold soil or tools. The same kind that could match the shape seen in the video. David claimed he had lent it to a friend for landscaping work. When contacted, the friend denied it. Under questioning, David said he couldn't remember who he lent it to. His story began to wobble. A forensic team examined David's SUV. At first glance, it looked spotless. But under the rear carpet, deep in the fibers, they found faint traces of blood. Samples were taken and rushed to the lab. Days later, the DNA results came back. It was Melissa's. There was still no body, no murder weapon, no confession. But the pieces were forming a chilling picture. A woman with no history of vanishing, who had every reason to stay, disappeared without a trace. Her belongings untouched, her dreams abandoned. Her husband grieving in public but scrubbing her existence in private. And with every passing hour, the truth grew darker. The investigation into Melissa Hampton's disappearance took a sharper turn as inconsistencies in David's statements began to multiply. He had claimed she often went on morning walks, but friends and family said otherwise. Melissa hadn't walked alone in weeks due to her anxiety and low energy. The path he mentioned as her usual route was only half a mile, yet she had been missing for hours before he even noticed. Nothing fit the narrative he gave. Detectives examined phone records. David's cell showed a flurry of late-night messages to a woman named Caitlin Brower, a local fitness trainer. Their communication wasn't casual, it was intimate. Just days before Melissa disappeared, David had wired money to Caitlin for a vacation they were planning. One payment stood out, a booking at a seaside resort under a different name, scheduled for 3 weeks after Melissa was last seen. Bank records revealed even more. Jewelry stores, expensive dinners, hotel reservations, all paid for using shared accounts David had once managed with Melissa. When questioned about the money, David insisted it was for business expenses, but the receipts said otherwise. It was becoming increasingly clear that while Melissa was missing, David was preparing for a new life without her. Melissa's sister, Grace, stepped forward with a discovery. While helping their mother clean out an old storage box, she found a journal Melissa had kept months before she vanished. It wasn't detailed, but the entries were filled with sadness, disappointment, and fear. One page stood out. Melissa had written that David had become cruel in silence, that he barely spoke to her anymore, and that he once called her a waste of space. She feared she was losing him, not to another woman, but to a version of himself she no longer recognized. That journal page was handed over to the police. Investigators revisited the doorbell footage from the neighbor across the street. Forensic analysts enhanced the video using software to clarify the contents. Although faces couldn't be seen, the figure's build and gait were consistent with David's. The object being dragged matched the dimensions of Melissa's garden storage bin. The timestamp also contradicted David's initial claim that he hadn't left the house that night at the same time. Forensics were still examining the blood found under the SUV's rear carpet. It was a small amount, but enough to confirm that Melissa had bled in that vehicle. David claimed she had once cut herself during a trip to the garden center, but no such incident had ever been documented, and friends said Melissa hadn't been inside the SUV in weeks. Detectives began interviewing more people from David's gym, where he was a regular. Staff members said he had become increasingly friendly with Caitlin, often waiting until her shift ended and walking her to her car. One employee remembered overhearing David joking about being a free man soon. Another said he once referred to his marriage as something he was ready to end. Search warrants were extended to David's devices. His laptop and phone told their own story. There were disturbing internet searches, all made in private browsing mode. How long does it take to suffocate someone? Can you bury a body without it being found? Decomposition in summer heat. Even darker were the draft emails. To Caitlin, never sent, where David spoke of starting over and finally being free of the extra weight. The last phrase caught the lead investigator's attention. It wasn't just a metaphor. It seemed like a motive. The district attorney began preparing for charges. But without a body, the case was delicate. Circumstantial evidence was stacking high, but they needed something definitive. A break came. Unexpectedly. A hiker, walking near a remote area of state parkland outside the city, spotted torn plastic tangled in brush. It was partially buried, the earth disturbed unnaturally. Authorities arrived, cordoned off the area, and began excavation. Underneath, wrapped tightly in black plastic and layers of tape, was the body of a woman. The remains were in poor condition due to exposure, but fragments of pink fabric were visible, the same robe Melissa had last been seen wearing. Forensic testing would later confirm what everyone already feared. It was Melissa. The discovery of her body shattered any remaining illusions. It turned a missing person case into a homicide, a quiet, suburban mystery into a calculated crime. And David's carefully built image as a heartbroken husband began to disintegrate under the weight of undeniable truth. The recovery of Melissa Hampton's body marked the point where suspicion became certainty. For months, David had maintained that he didn't know what happened to his wife. He gave interviews, offered rewards, and publicly played the role of the grieving husband. But now, with her remains uncovered in a shallow grave beneath rotting tarp and loose dirt, that mask could no longer hold. Her body told a story that David had tried to bury. The autopsy was brutal in detail. Melissa had suffered multiple blunt force injuries to the head and face. Her arms bore deep bruises and fractures, defensive wounds, consistent with someone trying to shield themselves. The cause of death was listed as asphyxiation. She had been smothered after the beating, likely with a pillow or plastic. The medical examiner noted signs of restraint on her wrists. This wasn't a sudden fight or a moment of rage. It was controlled. It was planned. With this confirmation, police arrested David Hampton at his office the following morning. He offered no resistance, but also showed no emotion. As he was placed in handcuffs, co-workers watched from the windows, stunned. David, always the clean-cut professional, was led away in a wrinkled dress shirt and scuffed shoes, looking smaller than anyone remembered. Back at the station, detectives laid out the evidence. Melissa's blood in the car, the doorbell camera, footage, the Google searches, the life insurance policy, the financial records, the affair. Most damaging of all were files recovered from David's laptop, a journal of sorts, hidden inside a password-protected folder. The entries weren't poetic or emotional. They were cold, practical, and disturbingly honest. In one, he wrote that Melissa had become a burden, that she had let herself rot, and that he was trapped in a body he didn't want to see. In another, dated only 9 days before her death, he listed pros and cons of starting fresh. Under pros, he wrote, no divorce mess, insurance payout, freedom to marry Caitlin, no more embarrassment. Under cons, he listed only one word, risked at a trial. The prosecution painted David as a man consumed by vanity and control. They argued that he had become obsessed with his appearance, status, and the image of success. When Melissa's body no longer matched that image, he saw her not as a partner, but as a problem to eliminate. They brought in witnesses who had seen the changes in his attitude, friends who described his growing cruelty, gym staff who recalled his strange comments, and Melissa's own sister, who testified about the journal entries her sister had written. In fear, the most damning moment in court came when forensic analysts presented a timeline built from digital footprints. They showed how, in the weeks leading up to Melissa's death, David had searched for body disposal methods, purchased materials later found with her body, and drafted emails to Caitlin promising that they'd soon be together without obstacles. They played a slowed-down version of the doorbell camera footage, linking the time to a gap in David's claimed sleep schedule. The figure dragging the bin was never clearly identified, but combined with everything else, it left little room for doubt. David's defense team tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial. They suggested Melissa had been depressed, that her death may have been a suicide or accident. They claimed the blood in the car came from a gardening injury. They tried to dismiss the journal entries as fiction, the search history as curiosity, and the affair as irrelevant. But the jury wasn't convinced. After 2 weeks of testimony and 3 days of deliberation, the verdict was delivered, guilty of first-degree murder. David showed no visible reaction as the judge read the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was silent. Melissa's mother wept. Her sister held a small framed photo of her, taken just a year before her death, smiling in front of her garden, hopeful, unaware. Caitlin, the woman David had planned to start over with, never appeared in court. She had broken off contact with him shortly after Melissa's body was found. In a brief statement to police, she said she had believed David's story about a failed marriage and a missing wife. When the truth emerged, she disappeared from the public eye entirely. David was transferred to a maximum security prison the following week. He remains there, silent and unrepentant. No appeals have been filed. What began as a missing person case unraveled into something far more chilling. A man so fixated on image and control that he saw murder as a solution. And a woman whose only crime was changing in ways he couldn't accept. David and Melissa Hampton were known around their suburban Cleveland neighborhood as the couple who seemed to have it all. Their beige 2-story house had flower boxes in every window, a neatly trimmed lawn, and wind chimes that gently sang with each breeze. Neighbors often waved at Melissa as she watered her rose bushes, always wearing her wide sun hat and gentle smile. David, clean-shaven and charismatic, drove a sleek black SUV and waved just as confidently. On the surface, they were a picture-perfect couple, but pictures only show what people want them to see. Beneath the surface, their marriage had started to crack years earlier. When they first met, David was drawn to Melissa's warmth and sense of humor. She made people feel at ease. She listened. She laughed easily. They had fallen in love quickly, married within a year, and settled into what many thought was an ideal life. But time, illness, and loss began to change everything, especially Melissa. After suffering a miscarriage, Melissa fell into a quiet grief that never really went away. Medical appointments uncovered thyroid problems that made her gain weight and sap her energy. Despite changing diets, medications, and new routines, her body kept resisting her efforts. She began to retreat inward, embarrassed by her appearance, frustrated by her limitations. The vibrant, quick-witted woman David had once known became quieter, slower, and less confident. David didn't handle the change well. He wasn't the kind of man who believed in weathering storms. He valued control, appearances, and admiration, things that didn't align with a wife he now saw as failing. At first, his disapproval came in silence. Then it turned into passive remarks, eye rolls, and emotional distance. Friends who visited noticed that David rarely spoke directly to Melissa anymore. She often sat in the background while he led conversations, always the center of attention, while she nodded quietly, hands folded in her lap. Melissa tried to fix things. She started new diets every few months, downloaded fitness apps, and even joined an online support group. But nothing seemed to bring back the version of herself she once knew. She hoped that if she could change physically, David would start seeing her again. She still loved him, even when he grew cold. She still believed their marriage was worth saving. But David had already begun to move on in his mind. The affection he once had for Melissa was replaced by annoyance. He resented having to explain her absence from social events. He hated the way people looked at them differently now. Slowly, quietly, he began detaching from the life they had built together. He started spending more hours at the gym, becoming obsessed with his appearance. That's where he met Caitlin, a young and energetic personal trainer who laughed at his jokes and admired his discipline. Caitlin. David was charming, successful, and misunderstood. He didn't tell her much about Melissa. When he finally did, he referred to his wife as someone who had let herself go, someone he had outgrown. Caitlin believed him. She had no reason not to. David knew how to tell a story that served him. Back at home, Melissa was still trying. She began writing again, something she had once loved. She started outlining a baking blog, something creative, to reconnect with herself. She even ordered a camera online, which arrived in a small brown box she never got around to opening. She told a friend she was finally feeling hopeful again. That maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Then came the life insurance policy. David told Melissa it was just a precaution, something smart couples did just in case. She signed it without protest. She trusted him. The policy totaled $750,000 and named David as the sole beneficiary. No one else knew about it at the time. Not her family, not her friends. Soon after, subtle changes began appearing. David started deleting old photos from their shared drives. He stopped mentioning Melissa in conversations. He began pushing her further into silence without ever raising his voice. On the outside, their home looked as beautiful as ever. But inside, Melissa was disappearing long before she was ever gone. She didn't realize that David had stopped seeing her as a person. To him, she had become a problem, something to fix, or worse, something to remove. He wasn't thinking about therapy or separation. He was thinking about erasing. Melissa kept fighting, unaware that she was already standing on the edge of something far darker than she could imagine. The woman who once lit up every room was trying to claw her way back into her life. But David was already planning a future that didn't include her at all.